Good afternoon, everyone. Welcome to our final panel for this amazing day, sponsored by and organized by the Black Law Students Association at Vermont Law School. My name is Robert Sand. I am a professor of law and the founding director of the Law School Center for Justice Reform. Our provocative topic for this final session is: will abolishing the Electoral College result in more equitable politics? And to help us dive into that topic, we have three wonderful panelists. I'm going to introduce them in the order that they will be speaking initially. And after they're done, we'll have some questions and then entertain questions from the audience. So first, I'd like to introduce Attorney Michael Donofrio. Attorney Donofrio works in the Montpelier office of an LA-based law firm, Stris and Maher. Originally from Vermont, he served as the first general counsel to the Vermont Green Mountain Care Board, which improves healthcare quality, access, and affordability. He has litigated many complex cases, including tobacco litigation. Significantly for our discussions today, he worked on amicus briefs in the litigation that went to the US Supreme Court on the question of so-called faithless electors, asking whether a state elector could vote for someone other than the majority vote getter in that state. Next up, Attorney Pratt Wiley. Mr. Wiley, Attorney Wiley is the president and CEO of the Partnership Incorporated, New England's premier organization dedicated to enhancing the competitiveness of the region by attracting, developing, retaining, and convening multicultural professionals. Attorney Wiley served as the National Director of Voter Expansion for the Democratic National Committee from 2013 to 2017, where he was responsible for designing and executing the DNC's program to ensure that every eligible voter was able to register and vote, and that every vote was accurately counted. Finally, and I'm not sure if she has joined us yet, but she will, State Senator Kesha Ram. Senator Ram serves Chittenden County, Vermont, which includes Burlington and surrounding areas, and is the first woman of color to serve in the Vermont Senate. Before that, when she served in the Vermont House, she was the youngest member of that body, and I believe the youngest person serving as a state representative in the country. Significantly for our discussion today, she served as an elector in Vermont for this past presidential election. So here's what I hope we can do. To get us started, Attorney Donofrio will spend about 15 minutes explaining how the Electoral College works and doesn't. When he's done, Attorney Wiley will offer thoughts about the Electoral College, and I hope touch on his work during the Obama administration. And then Senator Ram will have an opportunity to offer thoughts, hopefully as well touching on her experience as an elector at this most consequential and tumultuous relationship. So if that plan works for folks, I will turn it over in just one second to Attorney Donofrio. And I just want to say this, that once the three of you are done and we have Q&A, I hope you will not be shy about asking questions of each other. And I hope we can generate a little bit of controversy for a topic that absolutely is controversial. And with that, I will turn it over to Attorney Donofrio.
Thank you very much, Professor Sand. It's a real pleasure to be here. I really want to thank you. I want to thank Vermont Law School. I want to thank the Black Law Students Association. I really want to thank Elijah Freeman, who I fortunately made contact with a couple months ago, for including me in this amazing program. I was able to watch the first couple of panels, and it's just been great so far. In fact, I want to want to quickly pick up on something that Selena Stewart said during the first panel. She mentioned the army of pro bono attorneys who helped the League of Women Voters and other organizations during this election season. I was part of that. I had the honor to represent the League in a case involving the Navajo Nation in Arizona. And what I want to emphasize to folks listening is I did not come into 2020 with extensive experience in election law or voting rights law. I wanted to be involved, and I sort of raised my hand and got involved. And so I want to pick up, I just want to underscore that theme and say, do it if it's something that moves you, because you're needed and you'll be welcomed. So our topic is, will abolishing the Electoral College result in more equitable politics? And to take some of the suspense out of at least my part of this presentation, I think the answer is a resounding yes. I think folks probably have some awareness of the, frankly, racist underpinnings that lie at the root of the Electoral College, which had to do with the central tension at the Constitutional Convention between states in the South that allowed slavery and states in the North that did not. And that the Electoral College was a compromise that afforded a certain amount of power to states that did allow slavery. So there's that at its core. And I think abolishing it, almost for that reason alone, would make politics more equitable. So what I want to do, though, instead of, that's kind of the answer to our question, but I think that what's interesting is to talk a little bit about how we got where we are, and then to talk a little bit about where could we go from here. Because again, as I suspect most of you know, to get rid of it would require a constitutional amendment. There are some other pathways that we'll talk about, but it's not easy, I guess, is my point. But anyway, let me back up and give you a little bit of history about what it is and how it came to be. So on the National Archives and Records Administration's page for the Electoral College, the first line is, the Electoral College is a process, not a place. And I kind of love that, because college, we think of, a quad and students and whatever. But it really isn't a thing or a place. It is a process. And that's what the Constitution tells us. One of my favorite frivolous lawsuits that was filed in the post-election flurry was filed by an attorney named Eric Cardall, special counsel for the Amistad Project of the Thomas More Society. And I consciously call out folks who filed these lawsuits, because I think it really kind of calls into question many of our ethical duties as lawyers. But in that lawsuit, one of the many defendants named was the Electoral College, which kind of cracked me up, because I guess Attorney Cardall did not look at the National Archives webpage. Anyway, we are currently on what Akil Maher calls Electoral College 2.0. Electoral College 1.0 was enshrined in the Constitution in Article 2, Section 1. It was the last thing that the Constitutional Convention was able to accomplish and agree on, because there was so much disagreement among the delegates about how are we going to select our president. And again, that disagreement at its base was really this conflict between states that allowed slavery and states that did not, and the allocation of power among them. You had people like James Wilson and Madison sort of advocating for a national popular vote, even back then, pre-Constitution. And then you had founders like Hamilton looking for a more, middle ground compromise position. And of course, that's ultimately where it landed. So here's what Electoral College 1.0 consists of. And this is right out of the Constitution. Each state gets a number of electors equal to that state's whole number of senators and representatives. Each state shall appoint the electors in a manner determined by the state legislature. The electors shall meet in their respective states and vote by ballot. I'm using a lot of direct language out of the Constitution here. for two people, one of whom, at most, only one of whom can be from their home state. And really important, it just says two people. There's no distinction made among them. The electors then send those votes to the president of the Senate, and the president of the Senate shall open the votes in the presence of a joint session of Congress, and the votes shall be counted. And that exact passive voice language comes out of the Constitution too. I think it's weird that they use the passive voice there. I don't think there's ever been a question raised about who should do the counting. I think it's always been understood that it's Congress, but it's an odd way to phrase it. And then Article 2 says that the number one vote getter is the president, the number two vote getter is the vice president. Now, in the election of 1796 was interesting in that Adams was number one, Jefferson was number two. So you actually had a president and a vice president from two different parties. And that was the way the system was set up, and that was the way that vote played out. That didn't raise a ton of eyebrows. It didn't touch off a really heated discussion about, like, oh, we don't like this result, maybe we should change this process. So Electoral College 1.0 stayed in place for the election of 1800, and anyone who's familiar with Hamilton knows that the election of 1800 was a wild one. You had the Jefferson-Burr ticket running as Democratic Republicans versus John Adams and Charles Pinckney running as Federalists. Jefferson and Burr tied. So it wasn't clear it was clear they won. It was clear, those two people would be president and vice president, but it wasn't clear who would have which job, because all Electoral College 2.0 required of electors was vote for two people. They didn't designate, who they were voting for what. And in the background of these early elections, there were essentially understandings among the electors that you wouldn't ever do this. You wouldn't ever end up with the top two people tied. There were, explicit or sometimes tacit understandings that at least one elector would sort of slough off his vote to somebody else, not in a way that would jeopardize the party winning the top two slots, but in a way that would ensure there wouldn't be a tie. But as many of you probably know, Burr was really working hard behind the scenes to try to essentially leapfrog Jefferson, who everyone understood to be the presidential candidate on the ticket. And so we ended up with this tie. So per Article 2, Section 1, the decision as to who was doing which job went to the House. And the House took dozens of votes and could not reach a majority decision until, as famously chronicled in the musical, Hamilton sort of lent his support to Jefferson, and the House, which was dominated by Federalists at the time, because it's the outgoing House that's making this decision about who will be the incoming president. That was enough to tip it towards Jefferson. So nobody liked this. Everyone agreed this was a bad outcome. This tie, and then all these machinations that took place in order to break the tie. So Congress got right to work creating Electoral College 2.0. And the result of that work is the 12th Amendment, which Congress passed at the end of 1803, and the states ratified in 1804 in time for it to be in place for the election of 1804. And it made some other changes to the House contingent election process, but for our purposes today, it made one important change. It added the following language to the kind of the how the electors do their job. They shall name in their ballots the person voted for as president, and in distinct ballots, the person voted for as president. So instead of saying they shall vote by ballot for two people, now it's telling the electors, you actually have to designate. Interestingly, in the discussions and debates in Congress that resulted in the 12th Amendment, Congress considered all sorts of options, including getting rid of the Electoral College. And it remained a controversial enough topic. It was close enough in time to those original debates, you know, and of course it still invoked this whole allocation of power between states that allowed slavery and states that did not, that they couldn't do any sort of a big change. So they made this somewhat mechanical but very important change. And the result is they made a system that, while we can catalog policy reasons why we might say it doesn't work and we don't like it, it has at least yielded a result in each election since then. And there hasn't been this kind of, you know, this 1800 situation. So that's Electoral College 2.0, results from the 12th Amendment, and that's the process we still have today. Over time, with the rise of parties, really the rise of the two political parties, one evolution that's taken place in the Electoral College process is an expectation has evolved that electors will reflect the will of the majority of voters in their states. That results from a few factors. Electors are generally selected to be people who can be expected to be loyal to the party. Beyond that, many parties ask their electors to pledge to vote for the party's candidates if the party's candidates win the state's popular vote. Beyond that, states began to adopt statutes that say, if your side wins, elector, you have to vote for the candidate who won the popular vote in the state. And there are now, I believe, 32 states, including the District of Columbia, that have what we call binding statutes of this nature. And they vary in how they work, and they vary in their consequences. Some states impose a fine if an elector strays from the popular vote. Some states say, if you do that, you cease to become an elector, and you are immediately replaced with an elector who will vote, properly, so to speak. But at the same time, throughout our history, we've always had small numbers of electors who vote faithlessly, is the term we use. They vote for a candidate other than the person who won the popular vote. And every one of those votes throughout our history has been counted by Congress. Congress has never, when it convenes on January 6th to open the votes, there've been a few debates, but Congress has always decided to count those votes. I see I have 2 minutes left, so I'm going to try to go really fast because this part, I want to bring us up to current day. Earlier this year, the U.S. Supreme Court decided a pair of cases called Chafalo and Baca. These were cases brought by faithless electors from the states of Washington and Colorado. These electors attempted to vote and did vote for candidates other than the candidates who carried their state. In both cases, that was Hillary Clinton. What these electors were trying to accomplish was they felt that the will of the majority of voters in the United States was not that Donald Trump be president. And they felt that their role as electors was to reflect that will. Now, they didn't necessarily think they had any pathway to flip the result to Hillary Clinton. But what they hoped was that through a show of good faith and by voting for a Republican other than Donald Trump, they could convince Republican electors in states that Trump carried to vote for someone other than Trump. And if they could convince 37 such Republican electors, no one would have had an electoral majority, and we would have had the election would have moved to the House, to what's called a House contingent election. And these electors, their thinking was, who knows what the House will do, but our hope is that the House will choose somebody else, quite frankly. It was they made these decisions. It was very specific to the actual human beings involved in the 2016 election. Obviously, they could not draw away any Republican electors. They cast these anomalous electoral votes, and they were penalized by their states under their relevant state statutes. So they sued, and they said these state statutes are unconstitutional because while the Constitution says state legislatures control how electors are appointed, it says nothing about how electors vote once they're appointed. And the role of the elector doesn't make any sense if the states can tell us what to do once they've appointed us. That was the essence of their argument. The amicus briefs that I filed were on behalf of a really an outstanding historian of the Electoral College as well as the House apportionment process, named Michael Rosen, who had basically gone back and combed through all of the contemporaneous evidence from the founding and the 12th Amendment. And what he concluded is it's very clear if you go back and look through those materials that at that time, everyone's understanding was that electors were to exercise independent judgment. And they were to do so consistent with the will of the people, unless the people made a mistake. And I mean, we could spend a day talking about what the framers thought that meant, but I'll leave it at that in that kind of simple framing for now, and we can explore it more later. The Supreme Court sided with the states. The Supreme Court held that it is constitutional for a state to pass a law telling its electors, you have to vote for the candidate who won the popular vote in your state. And the way the court got there was, the court said, we've looked at the historical evidence, but what really sways us is not simply the historical evidence at the time that Article 2 was adopted, and at the time the 12th Amendment was adopted, but this evolution over time of this expectation that electors will reflect the will of the majority of their state's voters. And we think that voters, because of that practice, voters have an expectation now. And I just, that the final words of the decision are resounding. It was Justice Kagan writes, then too, the state instructs its electors that they have no ground for reversing the vote of millions of its citizens. That direction accords with the Constitution, as with the trust of a nation, that here we the people rule, and we the people is capitalized. So, and what's fascinating about the decision is it's 9-0. So none of the originalists try to push back on this notion that the best way to interpret this admittedly unclear constitutional language on this question of electoral authority, everyone was okay with this kind of historical gloss type reasoning. So that brings us to the present day, and I'm going to stop because I've gone over my time, and I apologize. So I'm going to hand the mic to Pratt.
Thank you, Mike, and thank you all for letting me know that I'm muted. That history lesson and that context was incredibly helpful for me as someone who was a practitioner, and look forward to sharing a little bit about the way that the Electoral College gets incorporated into our campaigns and our campaign strategy. But before I begin, I also want to thank Professor Sand, as well as all the folks at Vermont Law School, and especially the Balsa chapter at Vermont Law. Thank you for having me today and for this incredibly thoughtful and timely discussion. It was my true privilege to work under President Obama as the Director of Voter Expansion and Voter Protection. as Professor Sand mentioned in my intro, my responsibilities were at that time to ensure that every eligible voter could register, that they could then vote and be confident that their vote was accurately counted. This is actually a far greater challenge in our democracy than one certainly should expect and should accept, and one that was, as I mentioned, the true joy of my professional career and being able to advance the franchise for so many. The question of whether or not the Electoral College would yield more equitable campaigns and more equitable outcomes is a really loaded question. It's an incredibly loaded question. And I think, to be fair and not to sound like a law student or sound like a lawyer, it depends. It depends a lot on what we mean by equitable and what do we mean by campaigns. So let me just share a little bit about how campaigns work right now. And I'm glad that some of our previous speakers today have talked a little bit about the work of voter protection, because voter protection is really, at the end of the day, we're the lawyers protecting the efforts of all of the other aspects of a campaign. And so in its most simple form, elections are pretty simple, right? You are going to walk into a polling location. You're going to check in, give someone your name. They're going to hand you a ballot. You're going to go to a whether it's a voting station or some other remote location within that facility. You're going to mark your ballot. You're going to hand it to someone, and it's going to be counted. Now, each and every one of those elements is pretty simple. What makes it challenging is that you're multiplying each of those elements by, on a good election, 240 times, right? And the rules are different in almost each and every one of those instances. And that actually is an important piece to remember, that it is different for almost each and every one of those instances. We have over 57 election jurisdictions. So what we mean by that are the 50 states, the District of Columbia, as well as the territories. We have over 3,000 counties, as well as localities that are determining the specifics of how state election laws are being applied. We have over 180,000 polling locations. And each of those polling locations are going to have slightly different procedures, from everything from where you park to where you check in to where your voting station is located to where the actual votes are counted. All of this is to help provide some sense of the scale of a national election. All right, you're talking about 140 votes. You're talking about 180,000 polling locations. You're talking about 3,000 jurisdictions across 57 states, of which 51 are going to determine the outcome for the presidency, control of the House of Representatives, and control of the Senate. Right now, our campaigns are focused on a simple strategy called 270. And 270 is the majority of electoral votes that you need in order to win the presidency. And the way that the system works right now is actually, it's pretty simple. We are able to count with great confidence the columns in which the Republican votes in Utah and the Democratic votes in Massachusetts. We know that we do not need to spend a lot of time persuading voters in those regions. So we focus on those battleground states. We focus on the Ohios, the Floridas, the Virginias, the Georgias, and that is where the vast majority of our time and our resources are targeted. A campaign, at the end of the day, is really nothing more than the focused allocation of resources. And the game that exists right now allows us to focus our resources in a very, very targeted way. We know for certain that if Georgia is the battleground state, we know that there are 200,000 likely Democratic voters who aren't yet registered in the greater Atlanta region. We know that there are 50,000 voters who are likely Democratic voters who are not yet registered in the greater Savannah region, and that you can marshal your resources to identify, register, engage, and then mobilize those voters. You're able to bring support in from neighboring states. If you feel that if you're a Democrat in Alabama, there's not a lot for you to do on election day in terms of actually changing the outcome of that election. Your time is much better spent in Georgia. The same is true if you are in Nevada. If you're in California, your time is much better spent in Nevada than it is in California. What we recognize, however, is that these states get a disproportionate amount of attention from the campaigns. As a result of that, they get a disproportionate amount of the attention from the government, those winning candidates. And that is what in part drives our inequities. The other piece of the inequities themselves is whether or not, to Mike's point, it makes sense for us to even have these gatekeepers, these electoral voters at all. Let me get to that in one moment and just focus on a policy proposal that has gained a tremendous amount of support, and one that certainly we supported at the Democratic Party, and that's the National Popular Vote. And the National Popular Vote Compact it's actually pretty simple. States ranging from California to I actually believe that Vermont is a member of it, are pledging their electoral college votes to whomever wins the national popular vote. Once there are enough states that are a member of this compact so that at least 270 votes are represented. So in other words, once a majority of the states agree that the national popular vote winner should be the next president, regardless of whether that state was won by the Republican or the Democrat, the electors are going to vote in favor of the national popular vote winner. It is a policy, again, that is one that has gained a tremendous amount of traction, and one that I think deserves some merit in sort of talking about how that will play out in the real world. What that will mean, in addition to folks in New York and California getting more attention, even though right now they get none, it also means that our campaigns become national. It means that the Republicans in Massachusetts and the Democrats in Utah, all of a sudden their votes matter, and in a way that they haven't before. It means that the issues that are most important to the nation, the agenda that is most important to the nation, rises to the fore, rather than the regionalized issues that you will see in our battleground states right now. It's not a surprise that even if you think about our last several elections, that issues that are important in Florida and in Ohio take greater importance in our national dialogue than those issues that are important in New York and in California, even though the populations of New York and Florida are just about the same. By adopting the national popular vote, it nationalizes the agenda, and it forces our national elected officials to pay attention to the issues of the nation as a whole. That is the goal, that is the hope, that is the promise of the national popular vote. For those of us like myself who are campaign operatives, we also recognize that there are some downsides to that. The cost of our elections will increase significantly. It is a lot easier to buy ad time in Iowa than it is to buy ad time in San Francisco. It is a lot easier to focus on the turnout in Cleveland and Dayton and Akron and some of the smaller communities within a state like Ohio than it is to prioritize New York, Los Angeles, Houston, and some of our other large cities that all of a sudden would become battleground metros with a national campaign. And I think one of the other unintended consequences, there's an assumption that just because the Democratic Party has won the national popular vote each election since 1992, except for 2004, that would continue with a national popular vote, and that it would be good for the party. That assumption, it takes a lot of faith that our campaigns and our electorate are going to remain the same as they are today. And that assumption, more often than not, is false. One needs to look no further than Georgia and what we saw in the special election this month, what we saw in the general election in November, to see how states can change over time. When I first joined the party in 2013, one of my first responsibilities was to identify the battleground states of 2020. Where were the demographics changing? Where were the issues forming that might lead to states being more competitive in a national campaign moving forward? And Georgia was one of those states. Arizona was one of those states. Texas was one of those states, along with a number of others. What we did not anticipate looking at that same data was that several states would no longer become battleground states, that Iowa and Ohio, for example, would shift as quickly as they have. And that is because this is not a science, despite the fact that it's called political science and the fact that we spend millions and millions of dollars on our data. We don't know exactly how this will play out in the real world. Voters have a tendency to surprise even the most experience of political operatives. And so the conversation in terms of equitable, the conversation in terms of fairness, the conversation of what are the processes that we want to put in place that yield the results that we want to see, we need to be very clear about that. We need to be very clear about that. If we believe that a elimination of the Electoral College is the right thing to do because we believe that he or she with the most votes is the most legitimate winner, then that is fine. If we believe that the majority of Americans have policies that are not being adopted because of these small d anti-democratic policies, then actually this conversation becomes part of a much larger conversation. The math behind the 270 is the same math behind getting any bill passed in Congress. Right? You need 218 votes to get something through the House of Representatives. You need 51 votes to get something passed through the Senate. And that's assuming that there's no filibuster, in which case you need your 60 votes. The fact that the Electoral College is disproportionately weighted towards small states and rural states, you see that same effect in the Senate, because the Senate is what's actually causing that effect in the Electoral College. You actually see that very same effect in our House of Representatives right now. California has fewer votes per representative than Wyoming does. Wyoming representative represents about 500,000 citizens, and in California, the average California representative represents about 650,000 representatives, and that's not even the outliers. There are some states where they're representing close to 800,000 voters. These inequities permeate our entire federal government, and the Electoral College, in whether or not we decide to keep it, can be part of a larger conversation about whether or not we think these inequities actually lead to better results in terms of our democracy and in terms of our union. But what we know for certain is that if we remove these inequities just for electoral purposes, just because we don't like the results of a particular election or a particular string of elections, that what we anticipate being the outcome is more often than not going to be the case. It's been true for voter ID laws. It's true for voter registration restrictions. It's true for even when we make voting easier. What we expect in the short term often is true, but what happens in the long term actually surprises the vast majority of us. And so I know I'm bumping up on my time. I want to be sensitive to my other panelists here, but maybe I'm told I actually have a little bit more time. So let me just wrap this last piece up here. Elections are hard, right? Elections are very hard. And the role of the Electoral College is one that at the end of the day represents the time and effort of hundreds of thousands of people. Whether it is the field organizers who are knocking on doors, whether it is the digital organizers who are amplifying the message of our candidates, whether it is the folks who are helping raise the money to keep all of this going, whether it's the folks who are on TV making the case, and to the candidates themselves. When we start thinking about equity in our electoral systems, it really does start there. And so while the conversation about what to do with the Electoral College and the very end of the process is important, the far more important action is what are we going to do on the doors? And that equity actually starts with you. It starts with you as students. It starts with you as neighbors and activists. When you can knock on the doors, when you can have the conversations with your neighbors, with your town members, with your fellow law students, that is how change happens. And that is that is how systemic change happens. So whether or not the rules right now favor one party or one outcome, or they favor another, know that the easiest, most effective way to begin to change those outcomes and change the way that those parties act is really through your engagement and your civic participation. And with that, I don't know, Bob, if you want to turn it over to, if Kesha's not here yet.
Kesha's not here yet. Let me just say, Pratt, the message that you just delivered is the overarching message of the entire day, which is we are training individuals to be agents of change, and that is exactly where it happens. So there's the big question, broader equity through a constitutional amendment, but you've also mentioned, Pratt, some things or a thing we could do that doesn't involve such a grand plan. I want to get to what happens if we try to amend the Constitution, but before, let's talk a little bit about things that could happen short of that. So you mentioned, I'm going to just rattle off a few that I've heard about: national popular vote, blue migration, which is interesting idea that Charles Blow in the New York Times recommended. We have a surplus of blue voters in California, New York, Massachusetts. Maybe they could move elsewhere. mandatory voting. I think 5 countries require people to vote, incentivizing voter turnout, and statehood for Puerto Rico. But let me come back to national popular vote, the compact. My question is, isn't that a tenuous change? Because any subsequent state legislature for a state that had joined the compact could rescind that state's engagement. So how enduring could that be?
You know, I mean, excuse me. We're always at the mercy of state legislatures. So one of the very first things that the person in my role now at the Democratic Party is doing is looking at the docket across the nation and state legislatures, because you know for certain that there are going to be states that are going to file legislation advancing the Maine and Nebraska model for allocating electors, for example, right? Maine, it's your electoral votes are allocated primarily based upon the congressional districts, and so if you are a state like Michigan, if you're a state like Pennsylvania, where your congressional districts have been gerrymandered, then your electoral votes can be equally gerrymandered. So we're always going to, short of that constitutional amendment, we are going to be subject to the whims of the state legislatures. But what we know is that actually passing those types of reforms is incredibly difficult. And so, yes, national popular vote would still be subject to the discretion of a legislature, but once it's in place, it is much more difficult to remove.
There is also an element, you know, the National Popular Vote Initiative is both a piece of legislation and an interstate compact. And I confess, I haven't studied the compact itself, but there may be some force there that would at least require a state who's enacted it to stay in for like the next election, you know, so it wouldn't be able to kind of pull that bait and switch type of maneuver.
Great.
Kesha's
We
here.
have been joined by Senator Kesha Ram. I gave you just an absolutely fabulous introduction at the start, but and noted that you were an elector during the past election, and love to hear your thoughts about the Electoral College, and particularly gain some insight into what it means to be an elector.
Absolutely. Well, first, let me say it's an honor to join you. I'm sorry I was late. I'm actually on the Senate Government Operations Committee, which has a lot of jurisdiction over elections. And we even did have an idea advanced to us this year that we, quote unquote, do something about faithless electors, which I don't think has been a problem in our state in any recent memory. But I don't know what's already been said. So I will just start with my experience as an elector and see where it weaves into the conversation from there. So I'm sure I received a beautiful and warm introduction, so I won't go too much into my background. But it was a tremendous honor to be asked to be one of Vermont's 3 electors this year, even though I would say overall, I hope I am among the last in the Electoral College. You know, while this system still exists, it should be as diverse as our nation, just like Congress should be as diverse as our nation. And we know that's never true. That has not been true, let's say, and it's changing slowly. But I often get asked, how did you even become an elector? You know, whose radar did you have to be on? Because I would think of an elector as a very stuffy person who has a lot more institutional power and more connections than I do. I was fortunate enough to have a good friend who works in Congressman Welch's office, who's on the executive committee of the Democratic Party. And it was pretty clear, given our recent experience, that Vermont was going to swing Democratic. And you may have already heard that in Vermont, the Republican Party picks 3 electors and the Democratic Party picks 3 electors. and whoever wins the in terms of the outcome of our vote and the majority in Vermont, their electors are advanced to actually sign the documents and participate in the Electoral College. So we were pretty confident that the Democrats would have this one. And lo and behold, Vermont supported President Biden and Vice President Harris by the largest margin of any state. And so in the interim, my friend said on the executive committee of the Democratic Party, this is the first time that we'll have a woman of color on the ticket and being sworn in to serve in the White House. And we should make sure that one of our electors for the first time is also a woman of color, and try to break a little bit of that glass ceiling as well. He was successful in arguing that to the rest of the executive committee of the Democratic Party, and I was chosen as one of the 3 electors. I will also note in Vermont, because we only have 3, and also, you know, it shouldn't be too tight of a circle of kind of insiders. They really ask, unless there's some completely extenuating reason that it might change, that you only serve as an elector once. So, you know, well, as most people can not imagine having that honor ever, I imagine, you know, I am happy that this was my opportunity to be part of the Electoral College. And then from there, you know, once I was told I was a member of the Electoral College, I think the big takeaway is that nothing else happens after that. You know, you get a piece of paper that says you will faithfully elect the person chosen by the Democratic, you know, advanced as the Democratic candidate, because that you would only be an elector if the Democratic candidate won. And it's, you know, pains and penalties and being replaced as an elector. There's not a sort of there's nothing that feels lofty or aspirational about what you sign. You don't say, I'm signing this to uphold the Constitution and what's in the best interest of the country. You sign up to say, I will uphold the will of the people in my state. And that is a partisan decision as a Democrat if your Democratic candidate wins. So the Democratic Party had the power to replace me at any time if I was not willing to sign that form and nominate our electors. And nominate our president and vice president. I will say, on the morning of January 7th, I didn't sleep very well that night before. Some folks may recall what happened January 6th. Not too long ago, we faced an attack on our Capitol and an insurrection that will live on in history as a very dark day in our country. And I woke up right at 3:30 a.m. and went downstairs and just couldn't sleep. And a friend texted me at that time, another legislator who probably also couldn't sleep. And he said, hey, do you have access to C-SPAN right now? They're doing the vote count. They're doing the Electoral College count, and they're counting your vote. And so right in that very same moment in time, he sent me the link, and they counted Vermont's 3 ballots, which were numbers 269, 270, and 271 in the Electoral College, and gave Joe Biden and Kamala Harris the victory they needed to become the president and vice president in the delegate count. So that was an incredibly powerful moment. And, at the same time, I think you've heard all of the reasons why the Electoral College system is incredibly flawed. The reason I probably didn't hear from a lot of people is because Vermont wasn't in the spotlight as a state where anyone thought they could influence us as electors to change our vote. We had a few rumblings that might happen. Legislators were asked to weigh in and tell us that we should change our vote, et cetera. But there are plenty of other years where people around the country might be harassed. They might feel unsafe when they cast that vote. They might feel, sort of threatened to change the decision or, change the outcome somehow. You've probably heard about the court cases where people did not, faithfully fulfill their duty as electors. So, there's a lot of nuance. And I talked to one historian on the Electoral College who likes to call all the electors in the country and just ask them about their experience, at least one in every state. And when we spoke, she just said, I think we're a long way off from abolishing the Electoral College, but that can sometimes negate the real and meaningful ideas to streamline the Electoral College, to standardize processes in the Electoral College, and to fix the Electoral College. And so, she shared some of those ideas with me. I'm sure we're getting into those, but that's kind of my story and contribution about being an elector as a start.
Oh, I think you're still on mute.
Whew.
That was brilliant what I just said. So we've heard discussion of faithless electors, and if we allowed them, I think an argument could be made that that would be chaos. So, Mike, can you share with us what a benefit would be of allowing so-called faithless electors?
Yes. So first, to level set that point for a minute, there are still 18 jurisdictions, I believe, that where electors could behave faithlessly, meaning 18 jurisdictions that don't have any sort of a binding statute like we have here in Vermont, like Senator Rahm described. So it is still theoretically possible for electors to do that. Hamilton's vision of the elector was essentially as a safety valve, someone who would fulfill the will of the people unless the people were persuaded or whatever to elect a tyrant was the word that they used a lot in the Federalist Papers to describe a president who was way too king-like for what they were trying to achieve. And so I think that at the time that Article 2 was adopted, that was the vision, that electors would, in the hopefully every time, simply fulfill, instantiate the will of the people, but that the reason why they are human beings and they're not just numbers that get assigned based on a vote count, to the framers at least, was to provide this safety valve function.
And can I just add that the experience that the senator has is similar to what you have across the country. That many of the electors, certainly the partisan electors, these are folks who they're known to us. They're known to the state party apparatus. They are loyal. They are good Democrats. They are good Republicans, or for whomever is making that selection. They're not the folks. There already is a filter in place that it's rare that you are selecting the folks who are going to be faithless in the first place, because they are selected from the faithful.
Can I also just add, I forgot to mention, I was Kamala Harris's state chair when she was running for president. So, I think it also is a matter usually of the people who have been loyal to the candidates who make it out of the primary. That can also be a big determinant of, that helps bring together some unity. The presidential candidate, the vice presidential candidate, or maybe a strong detractor who's coming around and going to support them. But there's symbolism as well in terms of which candidates actually won the primary and are on the ballot.
Forgot my question. So let me ask a less existential question, and then I'm going to hit you probably for a lightning round with two really big questions. And for the question, and Pratt, you touched on this, what are concrete steps now that advocates and citizens can take to bring broader equity to the electoral process? I hope you'll all
at least in my opinion. Yeah. So in my opinion, the greatest equity issues are not actually in the Electoral College perversely helps bring equity to our electoral process. What you see across the country right now from an election administration perspective are these two competing dynamics. On one hand, you have pretty broad consensus amongst academics, election officials, the folks like myself who work in and around elections, about the policies and the procedures, the tools that we can use to make elections easier, more convenient, fitting for the 21st century, right? So whether it's same-day registration and automatic registration, early voting, updating our equipment. And what you see is there's actually broad consensus around this, regardless of party. You have adoptions in Maine and Massachusetts and Vermont, and you have it in Utah and Wyoming and Idaho. But then you have this other dynamic where, and again, I've got a big D painted on my chest here. You know, they paid me for a lot of years, but where one party believes that you can win more elections when fewer people vote. And so what you see in these purple states, these battleground states, are policies that are making it harder for people to vote and that are actively disenfranchising voters. The great irony of at least this conversation is that tends to stay isolated in those states that are battlegrounds. It's not a surprise that Pennsylvania has had more back and forth with their voter ID laws than any state except for Wisconsin, another battleground state. It's not a surprise that Florida is the location of more election litigation than any other state in the country. When we're talking about the margins between one party winning and one party losing, that's when these restrictive laws have the greatest impact. And the Electoral College has actually created a disincentive to pass those laws in California or pass those laws in New York. You see them in Texas, and you see them in many of our former Confederacy states, especially after the passage of Shelby. But those laws are of limited effect electorally. They're sending a powerful message to the power structure within those states. But in terms of their ability to actually change election outcomes, they actually have a pretty minimal impact. If we were going to remove the Electoral College, you now have an incentive for Republicans right now, who are the ones who are advocating all of these restrictive laws, to start proposing these laws in states that are safely blue and safely red that we just don't have right now.
Other thoughts?
I mean, just similar to what, and I don't want to call you Pratt. I don't know if it's Professor Wiley.
Please call me
I'm
Pratt,
sorry.
please.
Okay, Pratt. All right. So what Pratt said, if someone asked me where I was going to put money or attention or resources or political or legal energy, I would just say Texas. I would just say we need to win where we could win. And what Stacey Abrams showed us is that where you organize and invest in the future of your party, you will win, and that matters. And Democrats have still been stuck in, a lot of the white, labor, middle class battleground states. Shouldn't lose them entirely, but new coalitions are forming in the country. And we know that 55% of white women and 60+% of white men voted for Donald Trump. So, with everything that Donald Trump was saying, I don't know how many of those people were trying to get back in a coalition with folks of color and with, people who look and believe what I look and believe, So I think that says to me that the Southwest is an incredibly important place to focus money, attention, resources on organizing and bringing more people out to vote. And I think it's important to have a philosophical conversation about the Electoral College and the U.S. Senate, and that we have a system that greatly benefits small states in that way. Will those conversations, sort of change things overnight? Probably not. So, if you want to have impact, it's still about where you organize and how you build the coalition that's going to win.
Can I add one really quick thought to this part of the discussion? Much more like boring and in the weeds. I think in addition to the points that you both just made, another thing that we can do that's below the line of, amending the Constitution and getting rid of the Electoral College is making it easier for votes to be counted, and doing whatever we can to encourage states to adopt, for instance, in New York, I don't think they can start counting votes until, I think it's even after Election Day. And so, every state should be like, Florida in this regard, quite frankly. In Florida, they can start processing and counting early votes something like 22 days before Election Day. So, Pratt, earlier you were talking about the huge number of jurisdictions and election locations and election officials who make this machine go. I think that we serve small d democracy by standardizing and streamlining and optimizing that side of things as well.
I would caution, I agree. Oh, go ahead. I'm sorry.
No, go ahead.
I was just going to ask, I think that there are best practices, but one of the things that I actually came away with great appreciation for is our electoral systems very much represent the communities and the values in which they operate. And traveling the Southwest, you're not going to see a lot of town government, right? You're not going to see open meetings, and these traditions and these ways that we engage and that we govern matter. And so I absolutely agree with you that counting the votes earlier, allowing states to operationalize some of these practices makes total sense. But I think trying to find an electoral system that fits all 50 states would actually be a lot more complicated when we start to get into the weeds than it appears at first blush.
So, cognizant of the time, I have two lightning round questions for you. And the first is a compound question, and that is, will we end the so-called electoral college during the lifetime of any of our listeners? And will the union survive that process? So that's my first question. Anyway.
I'll go first. I'll go first. I don't think we will end it, because I think that we're still, as a nation, we're still too, I don't know if afraid is the right word, about the constitutional amendment process, even though the framers very much viewed the result of the Constitutional Convention as a proposal to the states that they fully thought should be updated and improved. I hope that I'm wrong about that, but that's what I think. If we did it, I think we would survive it, because I think we've survived a lot, as this past election shows.
I mean, I don't know how much the conversation before I got here was about what if Donald Trump had won again, losing the popular vote and winning the Electoral College? What if every day for the next 4 years, some fresh hell was wrought upon us? I mean, quite literally. And I mean, I knew people who had bags packed, who were ready to leave the country, who were very scared about what his reelection would mean. And every day that is wrought upon us, we're reminded that he lost the popular vote. So would it take a crisis that makes it close to ripping the country apart? Probably. Crises are often the only things that have ever changed anything. I often try to remember that income inequality was only rebalanced in a meaningful way after the Black Plague and World War II. So, often it does take a major crisis for us to wake up and say, this is not working. Is the Electoral College going to be the thing we rise up about? Probably not, but it would probably be such an overwhelming feeling that there was injustice wrought in this election and if this continues, we will eventually feel like an apartheid country where urban brown areas feel completely underrepresented and marginalized and no longer wish to live in a society like that.
And I completely agree with the senator. I think the situation that we find ourselves in right now, where the Republican Party is not just a plurality party, but it's a minority party that is able to exert majority control especially through the Senate and through our equating representation with geography, both in the House and the Senate. Unless the Republican Party has a mind shift and they begin to start the process of trying to persuade a majority of Americans, then this status cannot stand. And that I do actually think would mean maybe not the elimination of the Electoral College, but perhaps the adoption of something like the National Popular Vote Compact or one of the other the workarounds, because I think Mike is right. The constitutional amendment is a long, slow process that actually would require cooperation by the Republicans.
What may be my final question for folks, you wake up tomorrow and you are supreme commander of the universe, and you get to make one change that brings broader equity to the voting process in this country. What would it be? And I probably should have told you I was going to ask you that beforehand, but it's much more fun to see you wrestling with it. Attorney Donofrio, you went first, so I will pose that to you first.
Okay. I mean, there's a long list. I'll start with HR 1. I think that HR 1 has so many structural improvements to our democracy that if I believe the Senate is going to pass it, and I know that if it passes, the president will sign it. But the Senate it's still a razor thin margin, so I'll take that somewhat low hanging fruit and say that if I woke up tomorrow and with the stroke of a pen I could put all those positive changes into effect, that's where I would start.
So I was looking for the exact.
Was?
Oh, I'm sorry.
Go ahead. If you have an answer, I'm still thinking.
Wake up a lot and think, what if I was supreme leader here? What I was looking for is a quote I shared on Martin Luther King Day, and here it is. That to me, Bobby, when you asked the question, it was kind of like, okay, well, is it one law I would change? Because a law is very different than changing the hearts and minds of my fellow beings here. And, the quote is, while it may be true that morality cannot be legislated, behavior can be regulated. It may be true that the law cannot change the heart, but it can restrain the heartless. It may be true that the law cannot make a man love me, but it can keep him from lynching me. And I think that is pretty important also. And I've just thought a lot about that in terms of the pandemic and creating laws that keep all of us safe from the reach of the beliefs of others and how important that is. So, I can't, and then you said equity in voting, which is very different than just equity in this country, although they're so related. So, I would just have to go with my trifecta of very unsexy, but really important electoral reforms, which would be campaign finance reform, redistricting, and voting enfranchisement. And those issues get attention in such a small and, dramatic way in blips when people really want to pay attention to those things, and we see it in a lawsuit or something where it lost us a whole election. But those three things are so critical and deserve a lot more of our attention and effort to rebalance our representation.
I am going to echo both of those recommendations, and I would just add on that. Change, I think, matters. The single greatest factor that we need is more civic participation. And the reason we don't have greater civic participation is too many people do not connect participation with change. They do not connect participation with improving their lives in meaningful ways. And when we are able to more clearly connect those dots, either because of improvements in the ways that we communicate these policies or in improvements in what those policies are, then we make real difference. And then we begin to get a government that I think was the one that was envisioned by Hamilton and Madison all those years ago. With an electoral college or without electoral college, it wouldn't matter.
The work of democracy is messy. You get dirty, you get sweaty, but that is how change happens. It's not the flip of a switch. I wish we had much more time. We do not, but I am really appreciative, as I know all of our audience is, to the three of you. And Mike, you had let me know that you have a resource list, and if you send that to me, we'll be sure that it gets posted up on the website for the symposium. So thank you so much to the three of you. And I will now turn this over to Elijah Freeman, the president of the Black Law Students Association at Vermont Law School.
Thank you, Professor Sands. Hello, my name is Elijah Freeman, and I'm proud to be this year's BALSA president. I can't thank you all enough for tuning in to this year's Racing the Law Symposium. I'd like to start by giving thank you to the keynote speaker, Kendra Brown, our panelists, Sylvia Albert, Solicitor General Benjamin Battles, Patrick Berry, Frederick Brewington, Michael Donofrio, Eric Foner, Senator Kesha Ram, Selena Stewart, Juani Torres, and Pratt Norton Wiley. And our moderators, Professor Latham, Professor Portal, and Professor Sand. I would also like to thank the members of my e-board, Carice DeRue, Robert Baker, D.R. Raymond, and Shiana Hart, and our advisor, Dean Brennan, who helped us brainstorm the whole thing. Special thank you to all of the faculty and staff who helped this symposium become a success. The list includes Karen Henderson, Emily Potts, Dean McHenry, and Dean Jefferson. After hearing from all the panelists today, I hope you understand how voting and politics can affect people of color, and I hope you all can use the information you've learned today to be an advocate for change to help dismantle institutional racism in politics, in voting, and in America. Thank you.